I'm Eric Murdoch, coming to you from the doctor's office in Estes Park, Colorado. So a couple weeks ago, I was in Lander, Wyoming for the International Climbing Festival, and I met up with Luke Mehall, who's the publisher of the Climbing Zine and the host of the Dirtbag State of Mind podcast. We talked about the federal policies that are proposed right now and up for public comment, got into the weeds. And I really wanted to talk to him about what he's up to and climbing culture. So today, I'm really excited to be joined by Luke to talk about what he's up to and what the Climbing Zine represents in the climbing culture. Thanks for joining us, Luke.
Yeah, stoked to link up, and I enjoyed our conversation the other day, and I'm psyched to chat some more with you and kind of play the other end of an interview.
So can you tell us sort of what is the Climbing Zine and maybe even tell the inception story of the Climbing Zine? Because I think you're about 16 or 17 years old at this point.
So the Climbing Zine, I always pitch it as a first-person voice for climbers. So it doesn't matter if you can, we have professional climbers that climb at the highest levels who write for us, but we also have people who fail on the approach for a 5.7. And so if you can write about climbing well, we're going to publish your work. And I think the first-person personal narrative is a really compelling voice, and that's what I kind of try to cater the zine to. We also include poetry and art and different things like that too. And then the inception is, I started this in the kind of at the end of the glory days of climbing magazines. So before there was Instagram, before there was people checking their internet every day, you were waiting for a climbing magazine to come in the mail. And Eric, I'm guessing you're part of this generation. And I was writing ferociously in my 20s, and I probably got about 5% of what I wrote published in Rock and Ice or Climbing or the Mountain Gazette. And so I literally had these stories that no one else would publish. And one day I had a guy at a party come up to me, and his name was Hetty Eddie. He's like, "Hey, bro, have you heard of zines?" He's like, "You should start a zine." And so I'm like, okay, whatever, Hetty Eddie. And then a couple years later, I was in the Salt Lake City library, and I came across actual zines, and they were all like skate and punk rock. And I really didn't like the actual content because it was so abstract and they weren't telling stories, but I love like the format. And so I started some zines, and then my third ever zine was the Climbing Zine. And it was supposed to be a one-off kind of thing. I had a full-time job at the time. And here we are 16 years later, and life had other plans for the Climbing Zine, and it's kind of become my body of work for my life. So,
well, thanks for doing it. I read the latest volume, and it's big, it's extensive. It's got interesting poetry and images and stories. One thing that's really interesting to me about climbing culture and the climbing community is we've always had this tension between sort of art and science, right? So back in the 80s and 90s, we had John Becker, the scientist, and Peter Croft, the artist, doing their thing. And nowadays we've got Alex Honnold, the technician, and Chris Sharma, the artist and the passionate visionary. And it's always been really interesting to me and to play around with those ideas. Are you the type of person that projects the route and writes down all of your ticks, or are you someone who just goes out to the crag and just experiences the moment as it comes? I also see that dynamic in sort of organizations and publications like ASCA solves, the problem with bolts, and Access Fund solves problems with access. And at the same time, we have the zine, which presents these stories and ideas, and we sort of have that push and pull between art and science, and it sort of makes up the fabric of climbing culture. Where do you see the zine, and how do you see, the Climbing Zine's place, as well as the podcast, in, this dynamic that's so critical to how we experience climbing and how climbing will evolve into the future?
Dude, that's a hard question. We might need to break this down a little bit.
Yeah, break it down.
Yeah. So I have the artsy fartsy in my genes and my DNA. I am a poet first. Before anything, I wrote poetry, and I used to like write too soon poetry to girls when I was 20, stuff like that. So that's where everything comes to me first as this art. And I think the Climbing Zine has an artistic expression. I select things that I really like. The DNA of the zine is things that I like, but I also want it to be this artistic expression where other climbing publications, especially as they kind of neared their dying days, they were just creating BS for kind of a PR marketing agenda. And I always wanted to keep the zine as a pure expression for people to express their art. Um, all of that said, there's a format to a good story because, I was talking about the skate and punk rock zines before. They're so abstract and I wasn't getting a story out of them. So I think, there is a format within a story. I don't refer to any sort of template. People are like, follow the hero's journey or whatever. And Stacy Bear, who I'm sure you know of Stacy Bear, you know him. He broke that down. He's like, that whole thing is BS, and I couldn't agree more. So I think there is a science between a good story, a personal narrative. And then now I'm at full circle. I'm like, not even full circle, just going into the future. I'm getting AI pitches now, and it's like, it's a really annoying, but it's kind of a good test to see, oh, we need humans to create these stories because I can tell it's BS. Like I might be able to open the email and say, oh, this is actual pitch. And then I open it and it's just running around in circles with flowery language. But then, within climbing, flowery language can be really cool, but you have to root it in science. You have to root it in a story. So man, that's a hard question, and if you could break it down for me in other layers, I could probably answer it better. But that's my instinct is, artistic expression is so important for us as climbers, and I think each climbing individual is one of one, so our story is one of one, and that's what I want to showcase through the zine.
So we're talking about these ideas, but I was wondering if you would just share an excerpt from something you've recently written or published with us so we can sort of hear what the Climbing Zine offers and kind of what you're up to.
Yeah, no, it's funny. You asked me that late last night, and my brain was a little fried from looking at emails and stuff. And I'm like, I don't even know what I'm going to do. And then when you open the book to the page, and it's magical. And so I opened to an excerpt that I think is really appropriate for probably the next part of our conversation.
Is this from the latest volume
This
26?
is from The Dirtbags Aren't Dead. They're Just in Mexico, Part 2. And this is from volume 26, which is that fat zine that you're talking about. We added 64 pages. So it's our thickest zine yet. It was the weekend of Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, a Mexican holiday that celebrates and remembers those who have died. It is difficult to describe a feeling and a vibe from a culture that is not your own, but something otherworldly seemed to be present that evening. Consider this quote from the Mexican Museum about Dia de los Muertos. Those who passed are alive in our memories, a continuous echo that at certain occasions becomes louder. As the only answer to many of our questions, death is an integral part of life, and the living and the dead meet in this day to emphasize the importance of death in the cycle of life. As the darkness was approaching, there were quick draws that needed to be cleaned on Pangea. A chaotic energy surrounded what was a very simple task. I remember a climber going up but unable to clean all the quick draws, and someone else had to go up. By the time he was tying in, it was pitch black. He chose not to wear a headlamp and also climbed in approach shoes on someone else's rope. His belayer, in his early 20s, new to Potrero Chico, belayed him with an ATC. The calm of the early evening with Mexican music playing in the background was quickly interrupted with a violent fall. In that moment, I was certain it would end in death. I remember seeing Felipe out of the corner of my eye and sensing he was experiencing exactly what I was. My nervous system told me that this would be the most serious climbing accident I'd ever seen with my own eyes. But as soon as I looked up, the climber was dangling exactly 2 feet off the ground. He had fallen from the top of the route to the bottom, probably 65 feet or so. And that climb is like an classic 11 Potrero on the spires.
As we get older and experience more climbing and more life, And I think this is common to all climbers who are sort of committed. I mean, I know that you're committed to the end. You're a lifer, um, and I suppose I am as well. And I'm wondering, what kinds of stories are you interested in sharing today relative to 16 years ago, or when you were writing in your 20s? How has that changed as you've evolved as a climber, as you've seen more incredible experiences that you want to celebrate, and also seen some traumatic experiences that you've had to grieve? Yeah, how has that evolution kind of influenced the zine, and especially what things you're writing?
Damn, Eric, you're a really good interviewer. You should do this professionally. So I debated. So at the beginning of my 40s, kind of coming out of COVID, I had a big life change of, a relationship that was ending, a long-term relationship. And, coming out of COVID where there was some isolation. And then I started to question my voice, because before I was always a younger person with that dirtbag voice. And even going into the 30s, your friend group is still out there in big groups at Indian Creek. And then one day it just all kind of stopped. And I think COVID put it made that happen really quickly. But I spent years thinking, oh, I'm not going to write another book about climbing because I don't have that dirtbag climbing voice. And then I started spending a bunch of time in Potrero. I reconnected with the climbing community, and I think there's still an embrace. Just because you're in your 40s, the young climbers aren't gonna, they're interested. They want to talk to you. So I decided that I was going to fully dedicate myself to just writing openly about what it's like to be climbing in your 40s. And most of my friends had kids in their 40s. Not necessarily, but I feel like most of my climbing partners here all have young children, and I decided not to have children. So what's that about? And it's not as cut and dry as I don't want kids. It's this complicated thing, and I love seeing my friends become parents. And a lot of my dirtbag friends needed to become parents to be responsible, good people. They need wives or people to take partners to take care of them too. So I think it's still interesting to write about climbing in my 40s. I still feel like I'm a part of the community, where I don't feel like I'm a part of the dirtbag community, like hardcore. Like we were just up to Climbers Fest, and I had to go to bed at 10 o'clock every night. Like I can't stay out till 2 in the morning anymore. And so there's just this big difference. And I think I had to convince myself for a couple of years that it was still valid to write about my point of view and my perspective, even though I'm not this dirtbag climber anymore.
But the zine is interesting to me, as well as your podcast, because you can be a new climber or you can be a committed dirtbag, and there's something for you, right? You read these stories that are inspirational. You're just like when we started to get into climbing and we were devouring climbing magazines. And then for climbers who have been climbing for 30, 40 years, there's something for them also. And they can reflect on the types of experiences that you write about, like being up on a wall and being like, this isn't for me anymore. I want to do a different type of climbing. Um, is that something you specifically, sought to achieve, to appeal to the entire spectrum of climbers? Or is it just a product of the stories and poems and images that have been submitted to you for publication?
It's both. And recently, I think it's more intentional to help cultivate the younger writers, the younger artists, because, I mentioned AI earlier, and just the process of writing and the process of creating art is a lot of failure and screwing up and, um, messing up. And I being in your head. And so I worry about this younger generation of people who use AI for writing, use AI for art, and it's all BS. It's not going to go anywhere. So the it's really intentional to embrace the younger audience, and I'm lucky enough to have the only zine employee, Zaz, is a younger person, so they help me connect with the younger generation. So the connecting with the younger generation is very intentional, but then it's also the stories. If you saw my email inbox, it's all, I'm just filtering out the best of the work that I get. I publish, I tell people I publish about 5% of what I actually get, or maybe even less than that. So it's the community sending the story. So it's the community still being active. And occasionally I'll go find a story, or occasionally I'll see a piece of writing that I love, but it's really the climbing community coming at me. But then I also want to be more intentional because I'm not younger anymore. When I started the zine, I was young. So I was the voice of young people. And now I am not that. There's a whole nother generation. And then there's a whole nother generation below that. It's a combination of everything. And then it's really being intentional with making sure that if younger people aren't reading and consuming the zine and the podcast, I don't, the climbing zine and the podcast don't have a future, you know?
You live in Durango some of the year. I know you live in Mexico some of the year. And when you're in Durango, I know that you've participated in stewardship events and, you know, helping to remove graffiti right on local crags. And I've talked to you before about this and how it's not just about cleaning up the crag. It seems more meaningful to you. Can you talk about your experiences, you know, being a steward? So you're a climber, you're a publisher, but you're also a steward. You seem to do a lot of things for the climbing community, and I'm wondering sort of how that responsibility fits in with the rest of your identity as a climber.
Yeah, another good question. So Durango is so different from Potrero Chico, and that's the two areas where I'm mostly active, and Indian Creek more in the past. Let me think about this for a second. I feel like it's, you know, I feel like the world is such a hard place, and especially the last 10 years or whatever, it's national politics have been so frustrating. The change in our country has been so frustrating. And you're like, where can I make a positive impact? And climbing is so easy to do that with. If you see a bad bolt and you know how to fix a bolt, you can fix that bolt and literally save someone's future life. We were out at Indian Creek on the South Six Shooter, and there is an anchor that we actually replaced. It was a 5-piece bolt, and it was that second anchor on the South Six Shooter. I'm sure a lot of people listening have done this. It pulls out a ton. So these expansion bolts are not appropriate for that. So we replaced this bolt 12 years ago before we knew about glue and adhesive bolts, because glue and adhesive bolts are great for outward pressure and outward pull. And so we replaced this bolt, and then my friend climbed the tower in the winter with his girlfriend, and he said, "There's only one bolt left at this anchor." Dang it. So we went out there, and finally we knew how to do adhesive glue and bolts. And my buddy Tim Folks actually does this for a career now, building Via Ferratas and stuff. And so we went out there, and not only did we fix it, but we brought along some youngsters. We brought along Charlie Joe Dunn, who's Jimmy Dunn's son, who is just an incredible climber, and then his buddy Wesley. And so we showed them how to do it. And so we not only fixed something that could have literally saved somebody's life, because in sandstone, especially when these bolts get pulled outward, they are waiting death traps. You know, I think a lot of bolts that get replaced are actually quite safe. They're just rusty and they look sketchy. But in Indian Creek and some of the sandstone, they are actually sketchy, and people could literally die. So how could you I think climbing is just the easiest way to make a positive impact. And it's just right in there in front of your face. You know, if you're out in Indian Creek and there's a trail building day, you can take one day out of your schedule, or one day, your rest day, which is not really a rest day when you're building trails because you're hauling around big rocks. But you can then walk on that step and say, wow, I helped this situation with erosion. I helped build this trail. And so, you know, I'm disillusioned and frustrated with the state of our country and the state of the world, and I want to do things, and I feel like climbing activism is the easiest low-hanging fruit to make a positive change. And we were talking about this too. You know, sometimes they say bolting is a thankless job, but especially in Potrero, it is the most thankful job. People come up to me all the time and they're grateful, and they want to give me money, or they want to support it. And it's really cool to feel that love, to say, oh, I did this thing, and then I feel good about it. It's actually saving someone's life. And then I actually get positive interactions with people based on the act of it, you know?
Yeah. Thanks for all you do. And that was pretty eloquent, the way you described how you're thinking about stewardship. And I think the way you're sort of living out the climbing experience and the climbing life. It's a critical thread to the fabric of climbing. Like what you're contributing is significant. So thanks so much for all you do and for joining us and sharing a little bit about what you're up to in the Climbing Zine with the Policy RX audience.
Yeah, and I think I'm one of thousands of people that do this, and we all have those people we rely on for a phone call. I call Nate Lyles probably 6 or 7 times a year at ASCA when I can't figure out a bolting situation. I think rebolting, there's always a new problem, and I have someone like Nate I can call. And then Nate is my personal like hero with rebolting too. So I'm just one of thousands, and it's we're just all lucky to give back. You know, it's there's a something that it brings yourself too of giving back. It's not just for other people; you actually do it for yourself too.
So volume 26 of the Climbing Zine is out. And where can people get that? And what's in store for volume 27?
Yeah, so shop.climbingzine.com. You can subscribe. We're actually doing a 50% off sale through this month and maybe into next month. It's good for 50 people. We have an anonymous donor that supports that every July. And then I'm actually in the really exciting phase of creating a new zine, volume 27. So we're getting all that together. And I love working with new writers, and we memorialize climbers that have passed on, and that's really an honor to be able to work with. I'm working with someone right now who his brother passed away, and he was this front range undercover crusher guy who climbed barefoot. Barefoot Kev, I think, was his nickname. So I'm really excited to work with this writer in particular, and then yeah, working with younger writers too. So it's a really, some of the phases are tedious, like photo captions or getting it all ready for print. And then you have that one typo that, of course, always gets through a thousand edits. But I'm in the really exciting phase of working with writers and photographers to get it all together. And that's the most exciting phase until you actually see it in print. So,
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Luke. And to everyone who's been listening to Policy RX, thank you all. You know, we don't have a giant audience, but we have a really loyal audience, and I really appreciate all of the emails and questions and recommendations for new guests. Things are evolving, and people are really enjoying it. So we're going to keep doing it. Also, public comments are still open for the federal climbing guidance drafts for the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. They're open through most of August. Go to accessfund.org so you can find out a little bit more about those proposals and submit your comments. It's the responsibility of all climbers to kind of weigh in on these sorts of things that are going to impact the way climbing is managed and the way we see climbing for many decades to come. So with that, take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time.